Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Project Hypnos. Here I share real stories of unexplained encounters, sightings, disappearances, and strange lights in the sky to help you unwind, relax, and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments if you would. Now, find a comfortable place to rest. Dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade away, and get ready for another set of encounters from the edge of what we understand. I was driving home from a late shift at the veterinary clinic where I work as a technician, taking the back roads through rural Indiana farmland to avoid the traffic that builds up on the main highways, even at 11 p.m. It was early October, and the corn was at that perfect height where the stalks tower over your head but haven't yet begun to brown and wither. The fields stretched away from the narrow county road in all directions, creating walls of green that seemed to absorb sound and light, leaving the world feeling isolated and enclosed. I'd made this drive hundreds of times over the 3 years I'd been working at the clinic, and I knew every curve, every farmhouse, every field gate along the 20-mile route from work to my apartment. The road was usually empty at that hour, with maybe one or two other vehicles during the entire trip. It was peaceful in a way that helped me decompress after long days dealing with sick animals and worried pet owners. About halfway home, I was passing through a section where cornfields pressed close to both sides of the road, creating a green corridor that stretched ahead into the darkness beyond my headlights. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to make the corn stalks visible as a textured wall of vegetation, but not enough to see very far into the interior of the fields. That's when I saw movement that made me slow down and eventually pull over to the shoulder. Something was moving through the cornfield to my right, about 50 yards from the road. At first glance, it looked like a person walking among the rows, which wouldn't have been unusual except for the time of night. Farmers occasionally check their fields after dark, and teenagers sometimes use cornfields as shortcuts or meeting places. But as I watched more carefully, I realized that whatever I was seeing wasn't walking normally. The figure appeared to be gliding through the corn stalks without causing any disturbance to the vegetation. It moved in a perfectly straight line, maintaining a constant height above the ground that suggested it wasn't touching the earth as it traveled. The corn stalks that should have been pushed aside or trampled remained upright and undisturbed as the figure passed through them. I stopped my car and rolled down the window to get a better view. The figure was tall and thin, maybe 7 feet in height, with what appeared to be a dark cloak or covering that obscured any details of its form. It moved with fluid grace, as if it were swimming through air rather than navigating the obstacles of a planted field. There was no sound associated with its movement, no rustling of corn leaves, no footsteps, no indication that it was interacting with the physical world around it. What struck me most was the way it seemed to pass through the corn stalks rather than around them. When a person walks through a cornfield, they have to push plants aside, step over furrows, and navigate the irregular spacing of the rows. But this figure moved as if the corn weren't there, following a trajectory that cut across multiple rows without any adjustment for the terrain or vegetation. I got out of my car and walked to the edge of the field, trying to get a closer look at whatever I was observing. The figure was maybe 30 yards away now, still moving in that impossible gliding motion, still causing no disturbance to the plants around it. In the moonlight, I could see that it cast no shadow on the ground beneath it, and there was a quality to its movement that seemed to defy gravity. As I stood at the edge of the field, the figure suddenly stopped moving and turned toward me. Even though I couldn't make out any facial features or specific details in the darkness, I had the unmistakable sense that it was looking directly at me, aware of my presence and my observation. We remained motionless for what felt like several minutes, separated by 30 yards of cornfield, but connected by some kind of mutual recognition. Then, without any change in its posture or orientation, the figure began moving again, but this time toward me. It glided through the corn rows with the same effortless motion, approaching in a straight line that would bring it to the exact spot where I was standing. As it got closer, I could see more details that made my unease spike into genuine fear. The figure was definitely not human. Its proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in ways that human joints don't allow. Its movement was too smooth, too controlled, lacking the slight irregularities and adjustments that characterize biological locomotion. And most disturbing was the way it seemed to exist partially outside the normal physical world, interacting with light and shadow in ways that created a visual uncertainty about its exact position and form. When it was about 10 yards away, I could see that it wasn't touching the ground at all. It hovered maybe 6 inches above the soil, maintaining perfect stability despite having no apparent means of support. The corn stalks that should have been directly in its path remained completely undisturbed, as if the figure existed in a slightly different dimension than the physical world around it. I backed away from the edge of the field, keeping my eyes on the approaching figure while moving toward my car. But instead of following me onto the road, it stopped at the very edge of the cornfield, as if there were some invisible barrier that prevented it from leaving the planted area. It hovered there silently, facing me across the narrow strip of gravel shoulder that separated the field from the pavement. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, me beside my car, the figure at the edge of the cornfield, neither of us moving or making any sound. I could feel its attention focused on me with an intensity that was almost physical, as if it were studying me with the same fascination that I was studying it. But despite the strangeness of the encounter, I didn't feel threatened. The figure's presence was alien and unsettling, but not hostile. Eventually, I got back in my car and started the engine. As soon as I began to drive away, the figure turned and glided back into the cornfield, moving with the same effortless motion in the opposite direction. I watched in my rearview mirror until it disappeared among the stalks, once again leaving no trace of its passage through the vegetation. I drove the rest of the way home in a state of confused amazement, trying to make sense of what I had witnessed. I'd seen something that operated according to rules I didn't understand, something that could move through solid matter without interaction, something that existed in our physical world but wasn't entirely bound by its limitations. The next day, I drove back to the same section of road during daylight, curious to see if there were any signs of the figure's presence in the cornfield. I parked in the same spot and walked along the edge of the field, looking for any indication that something unusual had passed through the area the night before. The corn stalks were perfectly undisturbed. Not a single plant was bent or broken. Not a single furrow showed footprints or other signs of passage. The field looked exactly as it should have looked, rows of healthy corn growing in neat, parallel lines, with no evidence that anything had ever moved through them. I asked the farmer who owned the field if he'd noticed anything unusual recently, describing my experience as a possible wildlife sighting. But he hadn't observed anything out of the ordinary, and he mentioned that the cornfield was bordered by motion-activated cameras designed to monitor for deer and other crop-damaging animals. None of the cameras had recorded any unusual activity during the previous night. Over the following weeks, I made it a point to drive past that same cornfield every night after work, always watching for any sign of the floating figure. I never saw it again, but on several occasions, I noticed other anomalies, unexplained lights moving through the corn at heights that didn't correspond to ground level, areas where the moonlight seemed to bend or refract strangely, and once, the clear sound of movement through vegetation when the field appeared to be completely empty. I've never found a satisfactory explanation for what I witnessed that October night. The figure I saw moved according to principles that don't exist in our normal understanding of physics, interacting with the physical world in ways that suggested it belonged to some other realm of existence that occasionally intersects with our own. The cornfields of rural Indiana look the same as they always have when I drive past them now, but I know that they sometimes serve as pathways for entities that exist outside our normal perception of reality. Something glides through those green corridors when conditions are right, following routes that ignore the boundaries between dimensions, occasionally revealing itself to observers who happen to be in the right place at the right time to witness the impossible. I don't know what that figure was or where it was traveling when our paths briefly crossed, but I know that the world contains phenomena that operate according to rules we haven't discovered, entities that exist in the spaces between what we think we understand and what actually surrounds us in the darkness beyond our headlights. I spent 3 years working for a company that doesn't exist anymore, at least not under the name I knew it by. Meridian Research Solutions was listed as a data analysis firm with contracts in atmospheric studies and statistical modeling, but what we actually did was something entirely different. We cleaned up loose ends that other agencies couldn't handle through conventional channels, and we were very good at making inconvenient observations disappear from public awareness. I was recruited straight out of graduate school, where I'd been studying cognitive psychology with a focus on memory formation and recall. The job posting had been vague, something about research into observational reliability and human perception. But the salary was 3 times what I could expect anywhere else with my qualifications. The interview process was extensive, involving background checks, psychological evaluations, and what they called discretion assessments that tested my willingness to maintain confidentiality about sensitive information. The Meridian office was located in a generic business park outside of Reston, Virginia, the kind of place where dozens of government contractors blend into the suburban landscape without attracting attention. My orientation was conducted by Dr. Sarah Chen, who explained that our work involved perception management and information quality control for various federal agencies. She was careful not to specify which agencies, but it was clear that our funding came from budgets that weren't subject to normal oversight. People see things, Dr. Chen told me during my first week. Sometimes they see things that are perfectly explainable, but that create unnecessary public concern when they're reported or discussed. What she was describing in clinical language was a systematic program to discredit, explain away, or suppress reports of unusual phenomena. UFO sightings, encounters with unidentified creatures, unexplained lights, anomalous aircraft behavior, anything that might challenge conventional understanding or create public interest in subjects that agencies preferred to keep classified. My role was to analyze witness reports and develop psychological profiles that could be used to undermine their credibility or provide alternative explanations for their experiences. I would review statements, interview transcripts, and sometimes video footage, then write detailed assessments of the witness's mental state, potential motivations for fabrication, and susceptibility to suggestion or false memory implantation. The work was technically fascinating, but ethically troubling. Many of the witnesses I evaluated were clearly honest people who had experienced something genuinely unusual. But my job wasn't to determine the truth of their claims. It was to find ways to make those claims less credible or less interesting to potential investigators. For example, I might review a report of unusual aerial phenomena and note that the witness had been under stress due to a recent divorce, suggesting that emotional instability could have affected their perception. Or I might point out that someone reporting strange lights had been taking prescription medication with known side effects that could include hallucinations. The goal was always to provide authorities with tools to dismiss or redirect attention away from inconvenient observations. But the most disturbing aspect of my work at Meridian wasn't the psychological profiling, it was the direct intervention program. About 6 months into my employment, I was introduced to what Dr. Chen called therapeutic memory restructuring, a process that involved bringing witnesses in for what they believed were research interviews, then using advanced psychological techniques to alter their recollections of unusual events. The process was sophisticated and appeared to be based on legitimate therapeutic methods for treating trauma-related memory disorders. Witnesses would be contacted by researchers claiming to study the reliability of human observation under stress. They would be brought to our facility for what appeared to be standard psychological interviews, during which trained specialists would gradually introduce alternative explanations for their experiences. Through a combination of suggestion, false memory implantation, and what could only be described as targeted psychological manipulation, witnesses would leave our facility with substantially altered recollections of their original experiences. They might remember seeing conventional aircraft instead of unusual lights, or they might develop uncertainty about details that had previously been clear in their minds. I participated in dozens of these interventions, always in a support role, analyzing the effectiveness of various techniques and documenting the changes in witness statements before and after treatment. The success rate was remarkable. Nearly 90% of subjects showed significant modification of their memories within 2 weeks of intervention. But what bothered me wasn't just the ethical implications of altering people's memories without their knowledge or consent. It was the clear indication that the phenomena we were working to suppress were real. You don't spend millions of dollars developing sophisticated memory modification techniques to deal with hallucinations or hoaxes. You deploy such resources when people are observing something genuine that you need them to forget. The variety of cases that came through our system was extraordinary. Witnesses who had observed craft performing impossible maneuvers, people who had encountered entities that didn't match any known biological classifications, individuals who had stumbled across installations or activities that weren't supposed to exist. All of them were processed through our system, their memories altered, their credibility undermined, their stories transformed into more acceptable narratives. I began keeping private records of the cases I worked on, documenting the original witness statements before our interventions changed them. What emerged was a pattern of encounters with technologies and entities that suggested activities far beyond anything acknowledged by public institutions. People were regularly observing evidence of capabilities that exceeded known scientific limitations, but their experiences were being systematically erased from public awareness. The breaking point came when I was assigned to work on a case involving a family who had witnessed what they described as a large triangular aircraft hovering silently over their rural property. The parents and 2 teenage children had all observed the same phenomena, taken photographs, and filed detailed reports with local authorities. But the case had attracted attention from UFO researchers, and our job was to make the family's story go away. The intervention was more aggressive than usual. The family was brought in separately and subjected to intensive memory modification sessions that lasted several days each. When they emerged, their stories had changed completely. They now recalled seeing conventional military helicopters conducting training exercises, and they were confused about why they had initially described something different. But the teenage daughter, Emily, had somehow retained fragments of her original memories. During a follow-up interview, she became distressed and began describing flashbacks to the original sighting that contradicted her modified recollections. She was experiencing the psychological equivalent of 2 different sets of memories existing simultaneously, and the conflict was causing genuine trauma. I watched Dr. Chen decide that Emily needed additional treatment to resolve the inconsistencies in her memory system. The girl was scheduled for more intensive intervention that would essentially erase any trace of her original experience, regardless of the psychological damage that such extensive memory modification might cause. That night, I copied my private files and submitted my resignation, claiming family health issues that required me to relocate immediately. I knew that leaving abruptly would attract attention, but I couldn't continue participating in a program that was willing to inflict permanent psychological damage on a teenager to protect classified information. Meridian Research Solutions was disbanded 6 months after I left, officially due to budget cuts, but actually because of congressional inquiries that had begun to ask uncomfortable questions about memory research contracts. Dr. Chen and most of the staff moved to other positions within the same network of agencies, presumably continuing the same work under different organizational structures. I've never published the files I copied or spoken publicly about my work at Meridian until now. The people described in those files had their memories altered to protect secrets that someone decided were more important than their right to remember their own experiences accurately. Their stories were erased, their credibility was destroyed, and their encounters with the unexplained were transformed into mundane misidentifications. But the phenomena they originally reported were real. I know because I saw the evidence before it was suppressed, read the statements before they were modified, examined the data before alternative explanations were constructed. People are encountering technologies and entities that operate beyond our official knowledge base, but those encounters are being systematically removed from public awareness through methods that would be considered criminal if applied without government authorization. The program I worked for may have been disbanded, but the work continues under other names, other agencies, other organizational structures. Somewhere, witnesses are still being brought in for research interviews that leave them with altered memories and confused recollections. Somewhere, teams of specialists are still developing new techniques for making inconvenient observations disappear. And somewhere, the entities and technologies that people are encountering continue their activities, secure in the knowledge that any witnesses will be processed through systems designed to transform genuine experiences into false memories, ensuring that the public never develops a clear picture of what's actually happening in the spaces between official acknowledgement and hidden reality. The truth isn't being suppressed through dramatic conspiracies or heavy-handed intimidation. It's being gently erased through sophisticated psychological techniques that leave witnesses believing they experienced something entirely different from what actually occurred. And the people implementing these programs genuinely believe they're protecting national security and social stability by maintaining ignorance about phenomena that they've decided the public isn't ready to understand. But I remember what I saw in those files, what those witnesses originally reported before their memories were modified. And I know that we're not alone in the way we think we are, and that the activities occurring beyond public awareness are far more extensive and far more advanced than anything we're supposed to know about. My cousin Jake and I were exploring the abandoned property behind his family's farm in rural Nebraska when we found the barn that wasn't supposed to exist. Jake's grandfather had owned that land for 60 years, and according to family records, the only structures on the property were the main farmhouse, a grain silo, and a small equipment shed. But there it was, maybe half a mile from the nearest road, hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees that had grown up around it like nature was trying to keep it secret. It was August 2022, and we were both home from college for the summer. Jake was studying electrical engineering at Iowa State, and I was working on a computer science degree at UNL. We had decided to spend a weekend mapping the extent of his family's property using GPS units and satellite imagery, partly out of curiosity and partly to help his grandfather with some insurance documentation that required precise boundary surveys. The barn appeared on older aerial photographs dating back to the 1970s, but it wasn't on any recent surveys or property maps. It was as if someone had deliberately omitted it from official records, allowing it to fade from documentation while remaining physically present on the landscape. The structure itself was unremarkable, standard Midwest agricultural construction, maybe 40 feet by 60 feet, with weathered wood siding and a metal roof that had seen better days. What made the barn extraordinary was what we found inside. The interior had been completely gutted and converted into something that looked like a cross between a data center and a radio observatory. Banks of electronic equipment lined the walls: servers, monitoring devices, transmission equipment, and computer systems that appeared to be decades more advanced than anything either of us had encountered in our engineering coursework. Everything was connected by thick bundles of coaxial cable and fiber optic lines that converged on a central hub near the back of the barn. The most striking feature was the satellite dish mounted on the roof, visible through a large opening that had been cut in the ceiling. It was enormous, maybe 20 feet in diameter, and constructed with a precision that suggested military or aerospace applications rather than civilian communications. The dish was pointed at a specific angle toward the southern sky, and it rotated slowly and smoothly on motorized gimbals that allowed it to track whatever satellite it was communicating with. Jake and I spent the first hour just walking through the facility, trying to understand the scope and purpose of what we'd discovered. The equipment was obviously expensive and sophisticated, but much of it was labeled with manufacturer names and model numbers that neither of us recognized. Some devices had no labeling at all, just cryptic alphanumeric codes that might have been internal inventory numbers. What struck us both was how well maintained everything appeared to be. Despite the barn's aged exterior, the interior was clean, climate controlled, and obviously still operational. Indicator lights blinked on various pieces of equipment, cooling fans hummed quietly, and several computer monitors displayed streams of data in formats that looked like nothing we'd ever seen in our computer science classes. We tried to access some of the computer terminals, but they were all password protected or required authentication methods that we couldn't bypass. The screens we could observe showed what appeared to be signal processing displays, spectrograms, frequency analyses, and data streams that suggested the facility was monitoring or intercepting communications from multiple sources simultaneously. Jake noticed that one wall was covered with what looked like a massive circuit diagram, hand-drawn schematics that showed the interconnections between all the equipment in the facility. The diagrams were incredibly detailed and precise, but they depicted circuit architectures that neither of us had encountered in our engineering studies. Some of the components shown in the schematics didn't match any standard electronic symbols we knew. "This looks like someone's been designing custom hardware," Jake said, studying the wall diagrams. I was more interested in the data streams visible on the accessible monitors. The displays showed what appeared to be real-time signal interception from multiple sources: radio communications, satellite transmissions, and data protocols that I couldn't identify. Some of the intercepted signals appeared to be encrypted military communications. Others looked like civilian radio traffic, and a few seemed to be formats that didn't match any standard communication protocols. We spent hours documenting what we could with our phones, taking photos of the equipment, the wall diagrams, and the data displays. But every time we tried to record video of the monitor screens, the cameras would malfunction, either producing corrupted files or simply failing to capture the screen content, despite working perfectly for everything else in the facility. As afternoon turned to evening, we made a discovery that changed our understanding of what we'd found. Behind a rack of servers, Jake discovered a filing cabinet that wasn't locked. Inside were hundreds of documents, technical manuals, installation guides, and what appeared to be operational logs dating back to 1979. The documents revealed that the facility was called Station Echo 7 and was apparently part of a signals intelligence network that monitored communications across a significant portion of the central United States. The operational logs showed that the station had been collecting and analyzing radio traffic, satellite communications, and various electromagnetic signals for over 40 years. But what made the documents truly unsettling was their classification level and originating authority. They bore markings from agencies that we'd never heard of, organizations with names like Deep Signal Analysis Group and Electromagnetic Reconnaissance Division that didn't appear in any public records of government structure. Some of the technical manuals described equipment capabilities that seemed to exceed anything we knew existed in the civilian world. References to quantum signal processing, temporal frequency analysis, and dimensional electromagnetic monitoring suggested technologies that sounded more like science fiction than operational intelligence gathering. One entry from 1987 described intercepting a transmission that appeared to be a conversation between multiple parties, conducted in English, but originating from a point in space where no known satellites or spacecraft were located. Another entry from 1995 documented the reception of what appeared to be radio communications from a source that was simultaneously transmitting from multiple locations hundreds of miles apart. Jake and I copied as many documents as we could, taking photos of the most significant technical specifications and operational logs. But as we prepared to leave the facility, we made a final discovery that convinced us we were in over our heads. In a locked room that we'd managed to open using tools from Jake's truck, we found what appeared to be a communication center with equipment that was actively transmitting. Multiple radio and satellite communication systems were operational, sending streams of data to destinations that weren't identified on any of the control panels. Most unsettling was a wall-mounted display that showed a real-time map of the United States with hundreds of blinking dots scattered across the country. According to the display, our station Echo 7 was just one node in a vast intelligence gathering system that had been operating in secret thus for decades. We left the facility as the sun was setting, both of us overwhelmed by the implications of what we'd discovered. Neither of us slept well that night, and the next morning we spent hours researching the agency names and technical specifications we documented, trying to find some official acknowledgement of the programs described in the documents. But we found nothing. The agencies mentioned in the documents didn't exist in any public records. The technical specifications described capabilities that weren't acknowledged in any civilian or military literature. It was as if we'd discovered evidence of a parallel intelligence infrastructure that operated completely outside public awareness or oversight. 3 days later, Jake called me with news that made our discovery even more disturbing. His grandfather had received a visit from two men claiming to be from the Department of Agriculture, asking detailed questions about the family's knowledge of any unused structures on their property. When Jake's grandfather mentioned the old barn in the Cottonwood Grove, the men had quickly noted the location and left without explanation. We drove back to the site that afternoon, but the barn was gone, not destroyed or demolished, simply gone, as if it had never existed. The Cottonwood Grove was still there, but the clearing where the barn had stood was covered with grass and vegetation that looked like it had been undisturbed for years. There were no signs of construction, no evidence that a building had ever stood there, no traces of the sophisticated electronics facility we'd explored just days earlier. The aerial photographs that had shown the barn in previous decades now showed only trees. The GPS coordinates we'd recorded led to empty forest. Even the photos we'd taken with our phones had been corrupted or deleted from our devices, leaving us with no physical evidence of what we'd discovered. Jake and I never spoke about the incident again after that week. We both understood implicitly that we'd stumbled across something that we weren't supposed to know about, something that powerful organizations were willing to make disappear rather than acknowledge. The network of monitoring stations we'd seen on that map was still out there, still operating, still collecting intelligence that served purposes we couldn't understand. But sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas and I see isolated farm buildings or structures that seem slightly out of place, I wonder if I'm looking at another node in that hidden network. Somewhere in the American countryside, concealed in ordinary barns and sheds, a vast electronic intelligence system continues to monitor communications that the public will never know are being intercepted, searching for signals that originate from sources that officially don't exist. The truth about what's being monitored and why remains hidden behind classification levels that extend beyond any publicly acknowledged intelligence programs. But I know it's out there, listening, recording, and analyzing transmissions that reveal activities and communications that challenge everything we think we know about who's really sharing our world. I found the hoof prints in fresh snow on a Saturday morning in early December, leading away from my neighbor's pasture and disappearing into the dense pine forest that covers most of the land around my cabin in northern Minnesota. What caught my attention wasn't just the presence of hoof prints. Livestock occasionally escape their enclosures, and deer are common in the area, but their size and clarity. These were the largest hoof prints I'd ever seen, each one nearly 8 inches across and pressed deep into the snow despite the hard-packed ground underneath. I'd been splitting firewood in my yard when I noticed the trail crossing the open field between my property and the woods. The tracks were perfectly straight, showing no deviation or wandering that you'd expect from a grazing animal. They led directly from the fence line of Miller's horse pasture into the forest, spaced at regular intervals that suggested a steady, purposeful gait rather than the meandering path of an animal exploring or foraging. My neighbor Tom Miller keeps 3 horses, 2 mares, and a gelding, and I'd seen them in the pasture as recently as the evening before. But these hoof prints were far too large to have been made by any of his animals. They looked more like they'd been made by a draft horse, the kind of massive Clydesdales or Percherons that farmers used for heavy work before tractors became common. But no one in our area owned animals that large, and there were no farms within 20 miles that kept draft horses. I followed the trail across the open field, noting how the prints maintained their straight trajectory without the natural variation you'd see in an animal's track. Each hoof print was identical in size and depth, as if they'd been made by a machine rather than a living creature. There were no signs of the animal pausing to investigate interesting scents, no evidence of the casual sidesteps that horses make while walking, no indication that whatever made these tracks had any interest in its surroundings. At the edge of the forest, the trail continued straight into the dense pine woods, following a path that cut directly through terrain that would be difficult for a large animal to navigate. The tracks led between closely spaced trees, over fallen logs, and through areas of thick underbrush that should have forced any real animal to detour around obstacles. But the hoof prints maintained their unwavering straight line, as if whatever made them could pass through solid matter. I grabbed a measuring tape and camera from my cabin and followed the trail deeper into the woods. The prints were consistently spaced at exactly 4-foot intervals, with each hoof print pressed precisely the same depth into the snow. There were no signs of the animal that made them, no droppings, no disturbed vegetation, no broken branches that would indicate a large creature pushing through the forest. What struck me as increasingly unnatural was the way the trail ignored the topography of the forest floor. The prints continued in a straight line, up steep slopes and down into ravines, maintaining the same spacing and depth, regardless of the terrain. A real animal would have chosen easier paths, following natural contours and avoiding unnecessary obstacles. But this trail went straight through everything, as if it had been drawn with a ruler across a map. I followed the tracks for over 2 miles, deeper into the forest than I'd ever ventured before. The terrain became increasingly difficult, with thick undergrowth and fallen trees that made walking treacherous even for someone on foot. But the hoof prints continued unchanged, leading through areas where no horse could have traveled without leaving massive disturbance to the surrounding vegetation. Around midday, I realized something that made me stop and reconsider what I was following. In the 2 miles I'd tracked this trail, the hoof prints had never doubled back, never deviated from their straight line path, never shown any indication that the animal had turned around or even paused. The trail simply continued deeper into the wilderness, heading toward remote areas where there were no roads, no clearings, no destinations that would make sense for any domestic animal. I climbed a small ridge to get a better view of the terrain ahead, and from that vantage point, I could see the trail of disturbed snow continuing into the distance, maintaining its impossible straight line through valleys and up hillsides until it disappeared into forest so dense that even from elevation I couldn't see through the canopy. That's when I noticed something that made me abandon my tracking and head back toward home. The hoof prints I'd been following were filling in with fresh snow, but they were doing so too quickly. Snow had been falling lightly all morning, but not heavily enough to obscure tracks that deep. Yet as I watched, the trail behind me was gradually disappearing, as if the forest were deliberately erasing evidence of whatever had passed through. I turned around and started hiking back toward my cabin, but the return trip revealed something even more disturbing. The trail I'd been following was gone, not just fading or partially covered, completely absent, as if the hoofprints had never existed. The snow was unbroken and pristine, showing no signs that anything had passed through the forest that morning. I tried to retrace my route by following my own footprints, but even those were disappearing faster than the snowfall could account for. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, there was no evidence that I'd spent the morning tracking anything through the woods. The snowfield between the forest and my cabin was smooth and undisturbed, showing no trace of the massive hoofprints that had led me into the wilderness. When I got back to my cabin, I called Tom Miller to ask if any of his horses had gotten out during the night. He said all 3 animals were accounted for and had been in the pasture all morning. When I described the hoofprints I'd found, he looked puzzled and said that none of his horses were large enough to make tracks that size. I showed him the photos I'd taken, but the images were strangely unclear despite the good lighting conditions. The hoofprints that had been sharp and detailed when I photographed them now appeared blurry and indistinct, as if the camera had been unable to focus properly on them. The measurements I'd recorded showed dimensions that seemed impossible, hoofprints that were too large and too deep to have been made by any known breed of horse. Over the following days, I returned to the forest edge several times, looking for any trace of the trail I'd followed, but the snow remained undisturbed, and there were no signs that anything unusual had passed through the area. I began to question whether I'd actually seen the hoofprints or if I'd somehow imagined the entire experience. But I knew what I'd followed into those woods, and I knew that whatever made those tracks wasn't a normal animal. The straight line trajectory, the consistent spacing, the complete absence of any biological signs, and the way the trail had disappeared so completely all suggested something that existed outside the normal parameters of wildlife behavior. I started researching local folklore and historical accounts of unusual animal sightings in the area. What I found was a pattern of similar reports dating back over a century, stories of massive hoofprints that appeared in snow and led into the deep forest, always in perfectly straight lines, always disappearing without explanation. The earliest account I found was from 1887, when a logging crew reported following hoofprints, larger than any horse, deep into the woods near what is now the Boundary Waters Canoe area. The loggers described tracks that led through terrain no animal could have navigated, continuing in a straight line for miles, before simply ending at a clearing where the snow was undisturbed. Similar stories appeared in local newspapers throughout the early 1900s. Farmers and hunters who found enormous hoofprints leading into the wilderness, always following impossible straight-line paths, always disappearing before they could be fully documented. The accounts were remarkably consistent across decades, describing the same phenomenon I'd experienced, tracks that defied both animal behavior and physical possibility. I never found the hoofprints again, but I've become more aware of the subtle signs that something moves through our northern forests according to rules we don't understand. Occasionally, after fresh snow falls, I'll notice disturbances in the snow that don't match any animal tracks I can identify. Straight lines of compressed snow that lead from nowhere to nowhere, too regular to be natural, but too brief to follow. The deep woods of Minnesota hold secrets that predate human settlement, entities that follow paths invisible to us, but occasionally leave traces that we can stumble across if we're observant enough. Something with hooves larger than any known animal travels through our forests, following routes that cut straight through obstacles and terrain, heading toward destinations that exist beyond our maps and our understanding. I don't know what I followed into the woods that December morning, but I know it wasn't a horse or any other creature that belongs to our conventional understanding of wildlife. It was something else, something that moves through our world but doesn't quite belong to it, leaving traces that fade as quickly as they appear, maintaining the mystery of what shares these ancient forests with the animals we think we know. The hoofprints are still out there somewhere, leading deeper into wilderness that few humans ever see, following paths that have been traveled for generations by something that has learned to stay just beyond the edge of our awareness, revealing itself only through tracks in fresh snow that disappear before anyone can prove they were ever there. We were 3 days into a backpacking trip in the Cascade Range when something decided to visit our campsite in the middle of the night. My girlfriend Sarah and I had chosen a remote trail in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, one of those routes that requires a permit but sees few hikers even during peak season. We'd found what seemed like a perfect spot to camp, a small clearing beside a mountain creek, sheltered by old-growth Douglas firs and far from any other campers. The weather had been perfect all week, and we'd set up our two-person tent just after sunset on Wednesday evening, August 15th. We'd cooked dinner on our camp stove, hung our food properly to keep it away from bears, and settled in for what we expected to be a peaceful night in one of the most beautiful wilderness areas in Washington state. Sarah fell asleep quickly, but I stayed awake for a while, listening to the night sounds of the forest. The usual symphony of owls, small animals moving through the underbrush, and the constant murmur of the creek flowing past our campsite. It was the kind of deep wilderness quiet that makes city noise seem like a distant memory, broken only by the natural sounds that remind you how alive the forest is, even in darkness. I must have been asleep for about 3 hours when the first impact woke me. Something struck the side of our tent with tremendous force, hitting the nylon wall about 2 feet from my head and making a sound like a baseball bat hitting a punching bag. The blow was hard enough to shake the entire tent structure and push the flexible tent pole inward, briefly pressing the fabric against my shoulder. I sat up immediately, heart pounding, while Sarah stirred beside me but didn't fully wake. My first thought was that a large branch had fallen from one of the trees above our campsite. But when I listened for the sound of something hitting the ground outside the tent, I heard nothing. No crash, no rustling of vegetation, no indication that anything had fallen near our campsite. I reached for my flashlight and was about to unzip the tent door to investigate when the second impact hit. This time, whatever struck the tent hit the opposite wall near where Sarah was sleeping. The force was even greater than the first blow, hard enough to lift that side of the tent slightly off the ground and cause the rainfly to snap tautly against the tent body. We lay still for several minutes, listening for any sound that might indicate what had hit our tent. But the forest had gone completely silent. No owls, no insects, no small animals moving through the brush. Even the creek seemed muted, as if the entire ecosystem had suddenly become aware of some presence that didn't belong. I told Sarah to stay in the tent while I investigated, but she insisted we go out together. We both got dressed quickly and grabbed our flashlights before carefully unzipping the tent door. I half expected to find a large tree branch lying beside the tent, or some other obvious explanation for the impacts we'd experienced. But there was nothing there. No fallen branches, no displaced rocks, no signs of any disturbance around our campsite. The tent showed no damage despite the force of the impacts, and the surrounding area looked exactly as we'd left it before going to sleep. Our food hang was undisturbed, our gear was in place, and there were no footprints or other signs that any large animal had been in the area. Sarah and I spent 20 minutes examining the campsite with our flashlights, looking for any indication of what might have caused the impacts. We checked the trees above the tent for loose branches, examined the ground for rocks that might have been thrown or rolled, and looked for animal tracks that might explain the disturbance. Maybe it was a bear investigating our campsite, Sarah suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. We'd both been camping long enough to know what bear encounters sounded like, and this hadn't matched any of those experiences. We were about to return to the tent when I noticed something that made me stop and scan the forest more carefully. The silence wasn't just absence of sound, it was an oppressive quiet that felt unnatural and deliberately maintained. In 30 years of camping, I'd never experienced forest silence that felt so complete and so intentional. As we stood there listening to the unnatural quiet, I became aware of a presence watching us from the tree line. Not a visual observation, I couldn't see anything unusual in the forest, but a distinct sense that something was positioned in the darkness beyond our flashlight beams, studying us with focused attention. Sarah felt it too. "There's something out there," she whispered, moving closer to me while sweeping her flashlight beam across the trees surrounding our campsite. We couldn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Whatever was out there was large, intelligent, and completely motionless. It wasn't hiding exactly. It seemed confident that it could remain undetected despite our awareness of its presence. I called out into the darkness, identifying ourselves as campers and asking if anyone needed assistance. My voice echoed strangely in the forest, as if the trees were absorbing sound in ways they shouldn't. But there was no response, just the continued sense that something was evaluating us from a position we couldn't identify. We decided to return to the tent, partly because standing in the open felt increasingly uncomfortable, and partly because we hoped that whatever was watching us would lose interest if we appeared to be settling back down for the night. But we left our flashlights on and positioned ourselves so we could quickly exit the tent if necessary. For the next hour, nothing happened. The forest gradually returned to its normal nighttime sounds, and the oppressive sense of being watched slowly faded. Sarah eventually fell back asleep, but I remained awake, listening for any indication that our midnight visitor might return. Around 4 a.m., I was finally starting to drift off when I heard movement outside the tent. Not the heavy footsteps of a large animal, but a deliberate, careful approach that suggested intelligence and caution. Whatever was coming toward our campsite was making an effort to move quietly, placing each footstep with precision to minimize noise. I listened to this careful approach for several minutes, tracking the movement as it circled our tent at a distance of maybe 20 feet. The footsteps were too quiet and too controlled to be made by any large animal I was familiar with. They had the deliberate quality of someone who was experienced at moving through forest terrain without detection. The circling continued for about 10 minutes before the footsteps stopped directly behind our tent, maybe 6 feet from the back wall. I could hear breathing, slow, deep, and controlled breathing that suggested whatever was out there was much larger than a human, but capable of the kind of respiratory control that indicated intelligence. Then, without any warning, our tent was struck again. This time, the impact came from directly behind, hitting the back wall with such force that it pushed both of us forward and caused the tent stakes to shift in the ground. But instead of a single blow, like the earlier impacts, this was a deliberate shake, as if something had grabbed the tent and was testing its stability. Sarah and I both sat up, and I called out again, demanding to know who was there and what they wanted. The shaking stopped immediately, and we heard rapid movement away from our campsite, not running, but quick, purposeful steps that suggested retreat rather than flight. We got dressed again and conducted another investigation of the area around our tent, but once again found no evidence of what had been disturbing our campsite. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no physical signs that anything had been there. The tent showed no damage despite the force and duration of the impacts. We broke camp at first light and hiked out that morning, cutting our trip short by 2 days. During the hike back to the trailhead, we discussed what we'd experienced and tried to come up with rational explanations. Bears investigating human scents, falling branches that had bounced away from our campsite, even the possibility that other campers had been playing pranks on us. But none of those explanations adequately accounted for what we'd experienced. The impacts had been too forceful and too deliberate to be accidental, too controlled to be the result of normal animal behavior, and too isolated to be the work of human pranksters who would have had to hike miles in darkness to reach our remote campsite. When we reached the trailhead, we filed a report with the Forest Service describing our experience as a possible bear encounter. The ranger who took our report wasn't surprised by our story, noting that there had been several reports of unusual animal activity in that area over the past few months. When I asked for more details, he mentioned that other campers had reported similar nighttime disturbances, impacts on tents, sounds of large animals moving through campsites, and the sense of being watched by something that couldn't be observed directly. I've never returned to that area of the Cascade Range, but I've researched reports of similar encounters in other wilderness areas. What I've found is a pattern of experiences that match ours closely, campers being visited by something large and intelligent that investigates human presence without revealing itself, something that can move through forest terrain with remarkable stealth, but occasionally announces its presence through deliberate physical contact. The scientific explanation that makes the most sense is that we encountered a large, intelligent animal that has learned to avoid direct human contact while satisfying its curiosity about our activities. But the level of stealth, the deliberate nature of the interactions, and the complete absence of physical evidence suggest an intelligence and capability that exceeds what we know about any documented wildlife species. Whatever visited our campsite that night in the Cascades was real, physical, and purposeful. It struck our tent with enough force to wake us and shake our shelter, but it left no traces that would allow us to identify or track it. It demonstrated an awareness of our presence and activities that suggested intelligence, but it maintained a level of concealment that allowed it to remain completely undetected despite our efforts to observe it. The wilderness of the Pacific Northwest contains mysteries that extend beyond the documented wildlife that inhabits these ancient forests. Something large and intelligent shares these mountains with us, something that has learned to observe human activities while remaining invisible to human observation, something that occasionally announces its presence through interactions that remind us how little we actually know about what lives in the deepest parts of our remaining wild places. The dream started the same way every time. I would be lying in bed in a room I didn't recognize, surrounded by furniture that wasn't mine, looking up at a ceiling with water stains and patterns I'd never seen before. But despite the unfamiliar setting, I always felt like I was home, like this strange room was where I belonged. The feeling was so vivid that I would often wake up confused about where I actually was, needing a few moments to remember my real bedroom in my real apartment. In the dream, I would hear a sound that would make me turn toward the window, not a threatening sound, just something that drew my attention. A gentle tapping, like tree branches against glass, or the soft scratch of fingernails on wood. When I looked toward the window, I would see a silhouette standing outside, perfectly still, watching me through the glass. The figure was too indistinct to make out details, just a dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of night. But I always had the sense that it was looking directly at me with intense focus. What made the dream particularly unsettling wasn't fear. I never felt threatened by the presence outside the window. Instead, there was a sense of recognition, as if the figure watching me was familiar, someone I should know but couldn't quite identify. The feeling was accompanied by a profound sadness, a sense of loss that would linger for hours after I woke up. I'd been having this dream 2 or 3 times a week for about 6 months when my landlord told me I'd have to move out. The building was being sold to developers who planned to convert it to condominiums, and all the tenants were being given 60 days to find new housing. I'd lived in the same apartment for 4 years, and the prospect of moving was stressful enough without the added pressure of a tight housing market. After weeks of searching, I found a small rental house on the outskirts of town that fit my budget and was available immediately. It was an older place, probably built in the 1950s, with the kind of solid construction and quirky details that developers don't include anymore. The landlord, Mrs. Henderson, was an elderly woman who'd inherited the property from her sister and seemed more interested in finding a responsible tenant than maximizing rental income. The house had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly when you walked across them. What sold me on the place was the bedroom I chose as my own. It had large windows facing the backyard and got beautiful morning light that would make it easy to wake up naturally. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that the previous tenant had lived there for over 20 years before moving to a retirement community, which explained why everything felt so well established and settled. I moved in on a Saturday in late October, spending the weekend unpacking boxes and arranging furniture in my new space. By Sunday evening, I had the bedroom set up with my bed positioned so I could look out the windows toward the backyard, which was bordered by mature oak trees that were just beginning to turn colors for fall. That first night in the new house, I slept better than I had in months. The neighborhood was quiet, the bed was comfortable in its new position, and I felt genuinely relaxed for the first time since learning I'd have to move. I woke up refreshed and optimistic about starting this new chapter of my life. But on the second night, I had the dream again. The same unfamiliar room, the same water-stained ceiling, the same sound drawing my attention to the window. And there was the figure standing motionless outside the glass, watching me with that familiar intensity that I could never quite understand. This time, though, something was different about the dream. The room felt more familiar, as if I were starting to recognize details that had been vague before. The water stains on the ceiling had specific shapes that I could remember clearly when I woke up. The furniture arrangement was becoming more distinct, and I could see that the window where the figure stood was framed by curtains with a floral pattern that seemed oddly familiar. Over the next week, the dream became more frequent and more detailed. Each night, I would find myself in that same room, looking up at the same ceiling, hearing the same gentle sound that would draw my attention to the window. And each night, the figure would be there, watching me with what felt like patient attention, as if it were waiting for me to understand something important. What began to disturb me wasn't the presence of the figure itself, but the growing sense that the room in my dream was becoming more real than my actual bedroom. I would wake up feeling displaced, as if I were the one who didn't belong in my own house. The dream room felt like home in a way that my new rental house didn't, despite the fact that I'd never seen it outside of sleep. 2 weeks after moving in, I was lying in my actual bed, reading before sleep, when I heard a sound outside my window. It was gentle tapping, like tree branches against glass, exactly the sound that drew my attention in the dream. I looked up from my book and froze. There was someone standing in my backyard, just beyond the window, perfectly still and watching me. The figure was exactly as it appeared in my dreams, a dark silhouette against the night, too indistinct to make out features, but clearly human in form. It stood maybe 10 feet from the window, positioned so that it had a clear view into my bedroom. And just like in the dreams, I felt no sense of threat or fear, only that strange recognition and sadness that I couldn't explain. I sat up in bed, staring at the figure, waiting for it to move or react to my awareness of its presence. But it remained completely motionless, maintaining its patient observation. I got up and moved closer to the window, thinking that better proximity might allow me to see more details, but the figure stayed stubbornly indistinct, as if it existed in a slightly different plane of reality than the rest of the world. I turned on the bedroom light, hoping to illuminate the backyard enough to get a clear view of whoever was watching me. But when the light came on, the figure was gone, not running away or hiding behind the trees, simply absent, as if it had never been there at all. I went outside with a flashlight and searched the backyard thoroughly, looking for any sign that someone had been standing there. But the ground was soft from recent rain, and there were no footprints anywhere near the window. The area where the figure had been standing showed no disturbance, no indication that anyone had been there. The next day, I called Mrs. Henderson and asked if she'd had any problems with trespassers or people wandering through the property. She seemed puzzled by the question and assured me that the neighborhood was very safe, with no history of problems with unauthorized visitors. When I described seeing someone in the backyard, she suggested that it might have been shadows from the oak trees creating illusions in the moonlight. But I knew what I'd seen, and it matched my dreams too precisely to be a coincidence. That night, I set up a chair by the window and waited to see if the figure would return. Around midnight, I heard the familiar gentle tapping, and there it was, standing in the same position, maintaining the same patient watch. This time, I didn't turn on the light. Instead, I sat quietly and tried to understand what the figure wanted or why it felt so familiar. As I watched, I began to notice details that connected this real encounter to my dreams. The figure's posture, the way it held its head slightly tilted, the complete stillness of its observation, all of it matched the dream exactly. Then I noticed something that made everything click into place. Looking around my bedroom, while the figure watched from outside, I realized that the room I'd been dreaming about was this room. The water stains on the ceiling that had seemed so vivid in my dreams were actually there, barely visible in the daylight but clearly present. The furniture arrangement that had become familiar through repetitive dreams was exactly how I'd arranged my own furniture. I'd been dreaming about my future bedroom for months before I'd ever seen the house, experiencing the perspective of someone lying in a bed that was now my bed, looking up at a ceiling that was now above my head. And the figure watching through the window had been showing me this future, this place I would eventually call home. But that realization raised even more questions. Who was the figure, and how had it been able to show me this future through dreams? Why did it feel so familiar, and why was its presence accompanied by such profound sadness? Mrs. Henderson provided the answer when I asked her more detailed questions about the previous tenant. The house had been occupied for 23 years by her sister Margaret, who had lived alone after her husband died in a car accident in 1987. Margaret had loved the house, but had developed dementia in her final years, often becoming confused about time and place, sometimes believing that her deceased husband was still alive and would be coming home soon. When Mrs. Henderson described Margaret waiting by the bedroom window in the evenings, watching for her husband's return, I understood what I'd been experiencing. The figure in my dreams and in my backyard wasn't a threat or a stranger. It was Margaret, still maintaining her vigil, still watching through the window of the bedroom where she'd spent decades waiting for someone who would never come home. The dream stopped after I understood who had been visiting me, but occasionally, on quiet nights, when the oak trees cast moving shadows across the backyard, I still see a familiar silhouette standing by the window. Margaret is still there, still watching, still waiting with the patience that only love can sustain, still connected to the house where she'd been happiest and where she'd learned the difficult lesson that some kinds of watching can continue long after the watchers themselves have moved beyond the need for physical presence. I don't mind sharing the house with her. She was here first, and her love for this place has become part of its character, part of what makes it feel like home. The dreams she sent me weren't warnings or threats. They were invitations, ways of preparing me to understand that some houses come with residents who exist in the spaces between memory and hope, still maintaining the routines that once gave their lives meaning. My neighbor Jim asked me to help him move an old RV that had been sitting in the vacant lot next to his property for over 6 months. The local authorities had posted notices about removing abandoned vehicles, and Jim wanted to avoid any fines or complications that might affect his property value. The RV was a 1980s Winnebago, sun-faded and obviously non-operational, with flat tires and windows so dirty you couldn't see inside. We'd arranged to have it towed to a salvage yard, but before the truck arrived, Jim suggested we should check inside for anything valuable that might be worth saving or any identification that could help track down the actual owner. The door was unlocked, and when we climbed inside, we found the typical detritus of abandoned living: moldy clothing, empty food containers, and the stale smell of a space that had been closed up for months. Most of the personal belongings were worthless: old magazines, broken electronics, camping gear that had seen better days. But wedged between the cushions of the dinette booth, I found a leather-bound journal that was in remarkably good condition considering the deteriorated state of everything else in the RV. The leather was soft and well maintained, and the pages were filled with handwritten entries in blue ink that looked recent despite the age of the vehicle. Jim wasn't interested in going through someone else's personal writings, but I was curious enough to flip through a few pages while we waited for the tow truck. What I found was disturbing enough that I decided to take the journal with me, thinking I might be able to identify the owner and return it to them or their family, and described a journey across the United States that had become increasingly strange and frightening. The early entries read like a typical travel journal, documenting visits to national parks, encounters with interesting people, and the simple pleasures of life on the road. But as I read deeper into the journal, the tone changed dramatically. M began describing encounters with people and places that didn't seem quite right, experiences that suggested they'd somehow gotten off the normal routes of American travel and into areas where different rules applied. M feel like they were surrounded by variations of a single individual. Another entry described driving through a small town in Wyoming where every building was an exact duplicate of every other building, creating a grid of identical structures that extended as far as the eye could see. M had tried to find someone to ask for directions, but the town appeared to be completely empty, despite looking recently inhabited. M you described being unable to find their way back to familiar roads or recognizable landmarks. Um's was trying to reach. What made the journal particularly unsettling was how detailed and consistent the descriptions were. These weren't the random fantasies of someone experiencing psychological breakdown. They were careful, observational accounts of places and people that followed their own internal logic while being completely impossible according to normal geography. M wrote about staying at motels where the rooms were all identical but existed in different decades, allowing guests to experience the same location across multiple time periods simultaneously. They described truck stops where the fuel pumps dispensed liquids that weren't gasoline but somehow kept vehicles running indefinitely. They documented encounters with other travelers who claimed to have been on the road for years or decades, unable to find their way back to the places they'd started from. His journal. They described a growing realization that the highways they'd been traveling weren't part of the normal interstate system, but rather a separate network of roads that connected places that existed alongside but separate from ordinary America. One particularly chilling entry described meeting other RV travelers at a campground where everyone shared the same story. They'd all started out on normal vacation trips, taken wrong turns, or followed incorrect directions, and found themselves trapped in this alternate highway system where the roads led everywhere except home. M wrote about a trucker who claimed he'd been trying to reach Denver for 15 years, always finding roads that promised to lead there, but never arriving at the city he remembered. There was a family in a motorhome who'd been searching for their hometown in Ohio for over a decade, finding places with the right name, but wrong layouts, wrong landmarks, wrong everything. M has described various attempts to escape this alternate highway system. They tried following other vehicles, retracing their route exactly, even abandoning the RV and attempting to travel on foot. But every effort to return to normal roads led back to the same strange network of highways connecting impossible places. The last entry was dated just 2 months before Jim and I found the RV. M wrote about abandoning their vehicle in what they described as a lot between realities and attempting to find help from local authorities who might exist in the normal world. They mentioned hiding the journal in case someone found the RV and could understand what had happened to them, identity, and trace their journey. The license plate on the RV was registered to someone named Robert Martinez, but DMV records showed that Robert Martinez had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, a year before the first entries in the journal were written. Description. The addresses mentioned in the early journal entries led to empty lots or buildings that had been demolished years earlier. Description. M, or their whereabouts, M, had described visiting. Several of the gas stations, motels, and towns mentioned in the journal appeared in online reviews and travel forums described by other travelers who had encountered the same impossible locations and strange experiences. A truckers' forum contained posts from drivers who described getting lost on highways that didn't appear on any maps, finding themselves in areas where the same truck stop would appear every 50 miles for hundreds of miles in a row. Travel blogs included accounts of RV enthusiasts who had taken wrong turns and found themselves in versions of America where the geography didn't match anything they'd studied or experienced before. Most disturbing were the missing person reports that seemed to correspond to people who might have encountered this alternate highway system. Travelers who had set out on routine trips across the country and simply vanished, leaving behind vehicles that were eventually found abandoned in remote areas with no explanation for how they'd gotten there or what had happened to their occupants. His journal for over a year now, occasionally rereading entries and trying to understand what happened to them and to the dozens of other travelers whose stories appear in online forums and missing person databases. The journal sits on my desk as a reminder that the highways connecting our cities and states might be more complex and more dangerous than we realize. Somewhere in America, there's a network of roads that leads to places that shouldn't exist, serving travelers who can't find their way home and connecting destinations that exist in the spaces between our mapped and measured reality. M found these roads by accident, documented their experiences with careful precision, and left behind their journal as a warning for anyone else who might follow the wrong route into areas where the familiar rules of geography no longer apply. M exists somewhere beyond the reach of normal search and rescue efforts, still traveling roads that lead everywhere except back to the world they started from. And their abandoned RV sits in a lot that might itself exist between realities, waiting for the next accidental traveler who takes a wrong turn and discovers that not all of America's highways are designed to take you where you think you're going. It started during my night shift at the radio station where I work as an engineer, monitoring broadcasts and maintaining equipment for 3 AM stations that operate out of our facility in central Wyoming. I'd been working there for 8 years, and I thought I'd heard every kind of technical problem, equipment malfunction, and atmospheric interference that could affect radio transmission. What happened during the early morning hours of October 15th was unlike anything I'd experienced in my career. I was alone in the control room around 2:30 a.m., running routine diagnostics on our transmitter systems, when I noticed that all 3 of our AM frequencies were carrying the same audio signal, despite being programmed with completely different content. Our talk radio station, our classic rock station, and our news station were all broadcasting identical audio, a low-frequency tone that pulsed in a rhythm that was too regular to be accidental. My first assumption was that we were experiencing some kind of technical malfunction that was causing crossfeed between our broadcast systems. But when I checked our source equipment, each station was still receiving its proper programming feed. The talk radio station was getting its overnight syndicated content. The rock station was playing its automated playlist, and the news station was receiving its network feed. Yet all 3 were transmitting this mysterious pulsing tone instead of their intended programming. I tried switching to backup systems, thinking that our main routing equipment might be malfunctioning, but the pulsing tone continued on all 3 frequencies, regardless of which equipment configuration I used. Even more puzzling, the tone appeared to be much stronger than our normal broadcast signal, as if it were somehow amplifying itself through our transmission equipment. I called our chief engineer at home, waking him up to report what I thought was a serious equipment failure that might require immediate attention. But when Mike arrived at the station 40 minutes later, he couldn't hear the pulsing tone on any of our frequencies. According to his monitoring equipment, all 3 stations were broadcasting their normal programming without any anomalies. But I could still hear it clearly, the same rhythmic pulsing coming through every radio in the facility. We tested multiple receivers, checked our monitoring systems, and even used a portable radio to sample our broadcast signals from different locations around the building. Mike heard normal programming, but every radio I listened to carried the same pulsing tone. Maybe you're experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination, Mike suggested, though he looked concerned about my insistence that the signal was present. To prove that I wasn't imagining the signal, I recorded what I was hearing using my phone, holding it up to one of our monitoring speakers. When I played back the recording, the pulsing tone was clearly audible, confirming that it was real and not a product of my tired mind. But when Mike listened to the same recording, he insisted that he could only hear normal radio programming. We spent the next 2 hours trying to identify the source of the signal I was recording. We checked for interference from nearby transmitters, tested for equipment malfunctions, and even contacted other radio stations in the region to see if they were experiencing similar problems. But no one else reported any unusual signals, and our technical analysis showed that all equipment was functioning normally. Around 5 a.m., I decided to take a break from troubleshooting and drove home to get some rest. But when I turned on my car radio during the drive, I heard the same pulsing tone on every AM frequency. It wasn't just affecting our station's broadcasts, it was present across the entire AM band, from 530 kHz to 1700 kHz, replacing all normal programming with the same rhythmic signal. At home, I tested every radio I owned, a clock radio in my bedroom, a portable radio in my kitchen, even an old transistor radio I found in a closet. All of them picked up the pulsing tone on every AM frequency, creating a chorus of synchronized signals that filled my house with the same mysterious rhythm. I called my wife at work to describe what I was experiencing, and she agreed to test the radio at her office. But when she tuned to the same frequencies I was monitoring, she heard normal AM programming, news, talk shows, music, and commercials. The pulsing tone that was overwhelming my perception of AM radio was apparently audible only to me. That evening, I returned to the radio station for my next shift, hoping that whatever had caused the previous night's anomaly had resolved itself. But as soon as I entered the control room, I could hear the pulsing tone coming from all of our monitoring equipment. It had not only continued during the day, but had become stronger and more complex. The basic rhythm was still present, but now it was accompanied by what sounded like modulated data transmission, rapid bursts of digital information encoded within the pulsing carrier signal. I'd worked with enough data transmission systems to recognize that this wasn't random noise or equipment malfunction. Someone or something was broadcasting structured information on frequencies that should have been carrying commercial AM radio programming. I set up digital analysis equipment to decode the data stream I was hearing, using software designed to demodulate and analyze various types of radio communication. What I found was even more disturbing than the original mystery. The signal contained detailed information about radio transmission facilities across the western United States, technical specifications, geographical coordinates, and operational parameters that weren't publicly available. The data included information about military communication systems, emergency broadcast networks, and classified frequency allocations that I shouldn't have had access to through normal channels. It was as if someone with access to highly sensitive radio frequency databases was systematically broadcasting that information using a signal that only certain people could perceive. Over the following weeks, I documented everything I could about the mysterious signal, recording hours of audio and analyzing the data content using every tool available to me. The transmissions continued every night, always on AM frequencies, always containing sensitive information about radio communication infrastructure. I tried contacting the FCC to report the illegal broadcasts, but when officials investigated, they found no evidence of unauthorized transmissions on the frequencies I specified. According to their monitoring equipment, normal AM programming was present with no anomalies or interference. The signal I was receiving apparently existed in a space that official monitoring systems couldn't detect. I began to suspect that I was experiencing some kind of targeted transmission designed to be perceived only by specific individuals. Perhaps it was a test of new communication technology, or maybe it was related to my background in radio engineering and my access to broadcasting facilities. The most unsettling development came when I realized that I was beginning to understand the data structure of the transmissions without conscious effort. Information that had initially seemed like random technical specifications was starting to form patterns that suggested a comprehensive mapping of radio communication capabilities across multiple government and military agencies. I was inadvertently becoming a repository for classified information that was being transmitted through a channel that operated outside normal radio frequency monitoring. The signal had somehow identified me as a suitable receiver and was using my perception of AM radio to download sensitive data that I had no authorization to possess. 3 months after the transmissions began, they stopped as suddenly as they had started. One night, I arrived at work expecting to hear the familiar pulsing tone, but all AM frequencies carried only normal programming. The mysterious signal had vanished, leaving me with recordings that documented its existence, but no explanation for its purpose or origin. I've never reported the full extent of what I experienced, partly because I doubt anyone would believe such an account, and partly because I suspect that discussing the technical details of what I heard might violate security classifications I'm not supposed to know exist. The information contained in those transmissions revealed capabilities and systems that aren't acknowledged in any public documentation. But I know that somewhere in the radio frequency spectrum, there are communication channels that operate according to rules we don't understand, transmitting information to receivers who are selected through criteria we can't identify. The AM radio band that seems so familiar and ordinary actually contains layers of transmission that exist beyond normal perception, carrying data that reveals how much communication activity occurs in frequencies and formats that remain hidden from conventional monitoring. The signal found me through my daily interaction with radio equipment, identified me as a suitable receiver for information I wasn't supposed to have, and used my perception of familiar AM frequencies to transfer classified data that documented communication systems operating far beyond anything acknowledged in public records. And when the transmission was complete, it disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving only the knowledge that our radio frequencies carry far more information than we're supposed to be able to hear. My dog Buster disappeared while I was cleaning out the crawl space under my house on a Saturday afternoon in March. He was a curious beagle mix who had a habit of following me wherever I went. So when I started organizing storage boxes in the narrow space beneath my 1940s ranch house, he naturally squeezed in after me to investigate what I was doing. The crawl space was typical for houses of that era, about 3 feet high, with a dirt floor and stone foundation walls that supported the wooden floor joists above. I'd been putting off dealing with the accumulated junk down there for months, but spring cleaning motivation had finally gotten me to tackle the project. Buster seemed to enjoy the adventure, sniffing around the perimeter and occasionally pawing at interesting scents he discovered in the dusty corners. I was sorting through boxes of old books when I heard Buster moving around behind me, his tags jingling as he explored areas where I'd already cleared away debris. The crawl space extended under most of the house, and I could track his movements by the sound of his feet padding across the dirt floor and his occasional snorts of investigation as he encountered new smells. After about 20 minutes of work, I realized I couldn't hear Buster anymore. The jingling of his collar tags had stopped, and there were no sounds of movement coming from anywhere in the crawl space. I called his name, expecting to hear him scrambling back toward me, but there was no response. I grabbed my flashlight and began searching the areas where I'd heard him exploring. The crawl space wasn't large, maybe 800 square feet total, and there weren't many places where a 40-pound dog could hide. But despite checking every corner and calling his name repeatedly, I couldn't find any trace of Buster. That's when I noticed something I'd never seen before in all the times I'd been under the house. In the far corner, partially hidden behind an old water heater, there appeared to be an opening in the foundation wall. It was roughly circular, maybe 3 feet in diameter, and it led into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. The opening looked like it had been deliberately constructed rather than created by settling or damage. The edges were smooth and finished, and the surrounding stonework showed signs of intentional modification. But I'd lived in the house for 5 years and had been in the crawl space numerous times without ever noticing this tunnel entrance. I called Buster's name into the opening, and this time I heard a response, a faint bark that seemed to come from deep within whatever space lay beyond the foundation wall. The sound echoed strangely, suggesting that the tunnel led to a much larger area than I would have expected under a residential property. I tried to squeeze into the opening to follow Buster, but it was too narrow for an adult human. I could get my head and shoulders through, but my chest wouldn't fit through the remaining space. From what I could see with my flashlight, the tunnel extended straight back for several feet before curving out of sight. Buster barked again, and this time the sound seemed to be coming from above me rather than from the tunnel. I backed out of the opening and listened carefully, trying to locate the source of his barking. The sound was definitely coming from somewhere above the crawl space, apparently from inside the house itself. I climbed out of the crawl space and went inside, calling Buster's name and listening for his barks. But the house was empty, and when I checked every room systematically, there was no sign of my dog anywhere. I could still hear him barking occasionally, but the sound seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if he were somehow inside the structure of the house. I returned to the crawl space and tried calling into the tunnel again. Buster responded immediately, but now his barks were clearly coming from above my head, somewhere within the floor joists and subflooring of the house. Somehow, the tunnel under the foundation had led him to a space that existed between the crawl space and the main floor, an area that shouldn't have existed according to the construction of the house. I spent the next hour trying different approaches to reach Buster. I removed several floorboards from inside the house, thinking I might be able to access whatever space he'd found, but I discovered only normal construction, floor joists, insulation, and electrical wiring. There was no evidence of any hollow space where a dog could be trapped. I called a contractor friend who had experience with older houses, thinking that maybe there was some aspect of 1940s construction that I didn't understand. When Bob arrived and I explained the situation, he was as puzzled as I was. He'd worked on dozens of houses from that era, and none of them had hidden spaces between the crawl space and the main floor. Bob helped me search both the crawl space and the house interior, but we couldn't find any explanation for where Buster's barks were coming from. The tunnel opening was still there, still extending into darkness that our flashlights couldn't adequately illuminate, but there was no accessible route from that tunnel to any space within the house structure. Maybe there's an old basement or root cellar that connects to your crawl space, Bob suggested. We researched the property records and found that the original lot had indeed contained a root cellar built in the 1920s before the current house was constructed. According to the building permits, the cellar should have been filled in and sealed when the foundation for the house was poured. But clearly, some portion of it remained accessible through the tunnel we'd discovered. Bob brought specialized equipment the next day, a probe camera that could be fed into the tunnel to see where it led. What we found was a stone-lined chamber directly under the center of my house, maybe 8 feet square and 6 feet high. The space was empty except for Buster, who appeared healthy and alert, but unable to find his way back to the tunnel entrance. The camera revealed that the chamber had multiple tunnel entrances at different levels, creating a network of passages that extended beyond what we could see. Some of the tunnels led upward, which explained how Buster's barks could be heard from above the crawl space. The original root cellar had apparently been expanded over the decades, creating a complex underground system that existed entirely separate from the house's documented construction. We managed to rescue Buster by enlarging the tunnel opening enough for Bob to squeeze through and carry him back to the crawl space. The dog seemed none the worse for his underground adventure, though he showed no interest in returning to the crawl space area for several weeks afterward. But the discovery of the hidden chamber raised more questions than it answered. The stonework was clearly old, consistent with 1920s construction, but some of the tunnels showed signs of more recent modification. Someone had been maintaining and expanding the underground system long after the original root cellar should have been abandoned. We found evidence of electrical wiring in some of the passages, though it wasn't connected to my house's electrical system. There were also signs that the chambers had been used for storage, metal shelving brackets embedded in the walls, and anchor points that suggested heavy equipment had once been installed. I sealed the tunnel opening after Buster's rescue, using concrete blocks and mortar to prevent any future access to the underground system. But I occasionally hear sounds coming from beneath the house, footsteps, voices, and mechanical noises that suggest the hidden chambers are still being used by someone who has access through entrances I haven't discovered. The property survey shows only my house and yard, with no indication of underground structures or easements that would allow others to access the space beneath my home. But clearly, the tunnel system extends beyond my property boundaries, connecting to other areas in ways that aren't documented in any official records. Buster's disappearance revealed that my house sits above a hidden infrastructure that predates and underlies the residential development of the neighborhood. Someone built and maintains an underground network that serves purposes I can't identify, using spaces that exist parallel to but separate from the ordinary domestic life happening above ground. I've learned to live with the knowledge that there's another world directly beneath my feet, a network of tunnels and chambers where people move and work according to schedules and purposes that remain hidden from surface observation. Sometimes I wonder if other houses in the neighborhood sit above similar systems, if the entire residential area is really just a cover for underground activities that operate beyond normal municipal oversight. Buster never showed any interest in returning to the crawl space, but occasionally he'll stop in certain parts of the house and bark at the floor, as if he can hear sounds from below that my ears can't detect. He knows there's something down there, something active and ongoing that exists in the space between the mapped world above ground and the unmapped world that extends through tunnels and chambers that were never supposed to exist. My grandfather's lake house had been in our family for 3 generations, sitting on the shores of Crane Lake in northern Minnesota, surrounded by thousands of acres of pristine wilderness. It was the kind of place where city kids learned to fish, identify bird calls, and appreciate the profound quiet that comes with being far from civilization. But there was one rule that Grandpa enforced absolutely: no swimming after sunset, no matter how warm the evening or how inviting the water looked. The lake changes at night, he would tell us every summer when my cousins and I begged to go for an evening swim. Different things live in deep water when the sun goes down. We assumed he was just being overprotective, the way older generations often were about activities that seemed perfectly safe to younger people. The lake was clean and well maintained, with no dangerous currents or hidden obstacles that would make night swimming any more hazardous than daytime activities. But Grandpa's rule was non-negotiable, and none of us ever tested it while he was alive. That changed the summer after his funeral, when I was 22 and spending a week at the lake house with my girlfriend Sarah. We'd been there for 3 days, enjoying perfect weather and the peaceful solitude of the remote location. On Wednesday evening, we'd had a few beers with dinner and were sitting on the dock watching the sunset when Sarah suggested a nighttime swim. "Your grandfather isn't here to object," she pointed out, "and it's so warm tonight." I hesitated, remembering Grandpa's warnings, but unable to articulate exactly why I felt reluctant to break his rule. The lake looked inviting in the moonlight, and the temperature was still in the 70s, despite the late hour. There was no logical reason to avoid swimming, and Sarah was already changing into her swimsuit. 5 minutes, I said finally. We eased into the water from the dock, enjoying the perfect temperature and the way the moonlight created silver paths across the surface. The lake was about 15 feet deep near the dock, clear enough that we could see the sandy bottom during the day, but now dark with the mysterious opacity that deep water takes on at night. For the first few minutes, everything was exactly as pleasant as Sarah had predicted. The water was refreshing, the night air was warm, and swimming by moonlight had a magical quality that made me wonder why Grandpa had been so adamant about avoiding it. We swam lazy circles around the dock, talking quietly and enjoying the peaceful evening. Then something brushed against my leg. It wasn't the usual sensation of lake weeds or small fish that you might expect in natural water. This felt deliberate and substantial, like something large had investigated my presence and moved on. I mentioned it to Sarah, but she hadn't felt anything unusual. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, whatever touched me was clearly large enough to displace water, creating a noticeable current against my body. I stopped swimming and treaded water, looking around for any sign of what might be sharing the lake with us. Maybe it's a beaver, Sarah suggested when I described what I'd felt, or a large fish. But as we continued swimming, I became aware that we weren't alone in the water. There was movement below us, not the random activity of fish or other small aquatic life, but purposeful, coordinated movement that suggested intelligence. Something was circling beneath us, staying deep enough to remain invisible, but close enough that I could occasionally feel the water displacement from its passage. Sarah felt it too when whatever was down there passed directly under her. She stopped swimming and moved closer to me, her expression changing from relaxation to concern. "There's definitely something big down there," she whispered, as if speaking quietly might avoid attracting attention from whatever we were sharing the water with. We both began swimming slowly toward the dock, trying not to create splashing or sudden movements that might provoke whatever was below us. But as we moved, the underwater presence became more active, circling closer and occasionally breaking the surface tension in ways that created visible ripples radiating outward from points directly beneath us. When we were about 10 feet from the dock, something grabbed my ankle. It wasn't the accidental contact of an animal brushing against me. It was a deliberate grip that held on for several seconds before releasing. The sensation was of something with fingers, something that could grasp and hold, something that was definitely not any species of fish or aquatic mammal I was familiar with. I swam frantically toward the dock, Sarah right beside me, both of us now openly panicked by whatever was in the water with us. As we reached the ladder and pulled ourselves out, I could see movement just below the surface, dark shapes that seemed human in size and proportion, but moved with a fluid grace that was clearly adapted to underwater travel. We sat on the dock, breathing heavily and staring at the water where we'd been swimming just moments before. The lake surface had returned to its normal calm, but occasionally we could see subtle disturbances that indicated continued movement below, gentle swells and ripples that suggested large creatures swimming just beneath the surface. Sarah asked, wrapping a towel around herself while keeping her eyes fixed on the water. I didn't have an answer, but I was beginning to understand why Grandpa had been so insistent about his no swimming after dark rule. Whatever lived in the deep water of Crane Lake became active at night, and it was definitely aware of human presence in its domain. We went inside and spent the rest of the evening researching the history of Crane Lake, looking for any information about unusual wildlife or mysterious sightings that might explain what we'd encountered. What we found was a pattern of stories dating back to the early 1900s, when the area was first settled by European immigrants. Native American oral histories described the lake as a place where water people lived in the deep areas, beings that were generally peaceful but protective of their territory. Early settlers had reported seeing humanoid figures swimming in the lake at night, moving with capabilities that exceeded anything human swimmers could achieve. There were scattered accounts of nighttime swimmers who had been pulled under and never recovered, though these incidents were usually attributed to drowning in deep water rather than anything supernatural. But the pattern was consistent. People who swam in Crane Lake after dark occasionally disappeared, and their bodies were never found despite extensive search efforts. Most unsettling was a journal entry from 1923, written by a man who had owned property on the lake before my great-grandfather purchased it. The next morning, I called my great-aunt Margaret, who had grown up spending summers at the lake house and might remember stories that hadn't been passed down to my generation. When I described our swimming experience, she wasn't surprised. "Your grandfather saw them once," she told me. "He was maybe 16, out fishing with his father in the early evening when something grabbed their anchor line from below. When they pulled it up, there were handprints pressed into the metal, human handprints, but larger than any person could make." Margaret explained that the lake was connected to underground waterways that extended for miles through the surrounding wilderness, creating a habitat for creatures that were adapted to both underwater and terrestrial environments. The water people weren't malicious, but they were territorial, especially during nighttime hours when they were most active. "They've been there longer than any of us," she said. "Your great-grandfather knew about them. Your grandfather knew about them, and now you know about them." I never swam in Crane Lake after dark again, and I made sure to explain Grandpa's rule to any friends or family who visited the lake house. The daytime swimming was still perfectly safe, but as the sun set each evening, the lake transformed into territory that belonged to residents who had been there far longer than any human settlement. Sometimes, on clear nights when the moon was bright, I would sit on the dock and watch for signs of movement in the water. Occasionally, I would see ripples and swells that suggested large creatures swimming just below the surface, going about their nightly activities in the deep water that was their domain. Grandpa's warnings hadn't been about overprotectiveness or irrational fear of the dark. They'd been about respecting the boundaries of a shared environment, acknowledging that some places are home to beings whose presence predates human habitation and whose territorial rights are best honored rather than challenged. The lake house remains in our family, and Grandpa's rule remains in effect. We swim during the day, fish from the dock in the evening, and leave the night waters to the original inhabitants who have made Crane Lake their home for generations longer than any human records can document. It's a peaceful arrangement that serves everyone involved, as long as we remember that some places belong to others when the sun goes down. I'd been working the night shift at Mel's Diner for 3 years, serving coffee and pie to truckers, insomniacs, and the occasional lost traveler who found their way to our little truck stop on Highway 287 outside of Amarillo. It was the kind of place where you got to know the regular customers, where conversations followed predictable patterns, and where surprises were rare enough to be noteworthy. That's what made the events of last Tuesday night so unsettling. It was around 2:30 a.m., and the diner was nearly empty except for Earl, a long-haul trucker who stopped by every few weeks, and a young couple who'd been nursing coffee and sharing a piece of apple pie for the past hour. I was wiping down tables and refilling salt shakers when the bell above the door chimed to announce another customer. The woman who walked in was probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and clothes that looked expensive but understated. She wasn't the type of customer we usually saw during the late shift. Too well dressed for a trucker, too old to be a college student driving through the night, too composed to be someone dealing with a roadside emergency. She looked around the diner with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was looking for something specific. She chose a booth near the window and picked up a menu, though she seemed more interested in watching me than in reading about our food options. When I approached her table with a pot of coffee, she looked up at me with a smile that was both warm and somehow familiar, though I was certain I'd never seen her before. "Good evening, Rebecca," she said, and my hand froze halfway to turning over her coffee cup. I hadn't been wearing a name tag. Mine had broken earlier in the week, and I'd been meaning to request a replacement. There was nothing visible that would have told her my name, and I was sure I'd never served her before. In 3 years of working nights at Mel's, I'd developed a good memory for faces, especially unusual customers who stood out from our typical late-night crowd. I asked, setting the coffee pot down on the table and studying her face more carefully. "Not exactly," she replied, pouring cream into her coffee with steady hands. "But I know quite a bit about you. You're Rebecca Martinez, 26 years old, originally from El Paso. You moved to Amarillo 3 years ago after your divorce, and you've been working here ever since." Every detail was correct, but I felt my stomach drop as I realized that this information wasn't something a stranger should have known. My personal life wasn't public knowledge, and I'd been careful about privacy since my divorce. I hadn't told most of my coworkers about my plans for nursing school, and I certainly hadn't shared my address with customers. I asked, glancing around the diner to see if Earl or the young couple had noticed our conversation, but they seemed absorbed in their own activities, apparently unaware that anything unusual was happening. "I know because it's my job to know," the woman said calmly. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I work for an organization that monitors certain individuals who have had unusual experiences." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. 6 months ago, I'd had an experience that I'd never told anyone about, an encounter that I'd tried to convince myself was a stress-induced hallucination or a vivid dream. But this stranger seemed to know about it, which meant that either I hadn't imagined it or someone had been watching me more closely than I'd realized. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to myself. Dr. Chen opened a small briefcase that she'd placed beside her on the booth seat and withdrew a manila folder. She opened it and showed me a photograph that made my hands start shaking. It was a picture of me standing in my backyard at night, looking up at something in the sky. But what made the photo truly disturbing was that I remembered the moment it captured, and I was certain that no one else had been present when it was taken. This was taken on March 15th at approximately 11:47 p.m., Dr. Chen said, showing me additional photos that documented the entire encounter I'd tried so hard to forget. You observed an unidentified aerial phenomenon for approximately 12 minutes. You attempted to photograph it with your phone, but the images didn't develop properly. The photos showed everything exactly as I remembered it. The strange lights moving in patterns that defied conventional aircraft behavior, my own attempts to document what I was seeing, and my obvious fascination and fear as I watched something that shouldn't have existed according to everything I understood about reality. I asked, sitting down across from her without being invited. I represent an organization that investigates reports of unusual phenomena and monitors individuals who have had significant encounters, she explained. She showed me more documents from the folder, detailed reports of my movements and activities over the past 6 months, including places I'd visited, people I'd talked to, and even conversations I'd had that no one should have been able to record. The level of surveillance was far beyond anything I'd imagined possible, and it suggested resources and capabilities that extended well beyond normal law enforcement or private investigation. I asked, feeling increasingly trapped by the realization that my privacy had been completely compromised for months without my knowledge. "We want to offer you an opportunity," Dr. Chen said, closing the folder and leaning forward with an expression that seemed genuinely concerned. "People who have had encounters like yours often experience additional phenomena." She explained that her organization was recruiting individuals with proven sensitivity to anomalous phenomena, people who could serve as early warning systems for activities that traditional monitoring couldn't detect. The work would involve regular reports about anything unusual I observed, participation in periodic interviews and testing, and cooperation with investigations that might arise from my observations. I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Then you'll continue to be monitored from a distance," she said matter-of-factly, "but you won't receive the protection and support that comes with official cooperation." She left a business card with a phone number and told me I had 48 hours to decide whether to accept their offer. Then she paid for her coffee, left a generous tip, and walked out of the diner as quietly as she'd arrived. I spent the rest of my shift trying to process what had happened, replaying our conversation and examining the business card that bore no company name, just Dr. Chen's name and a phone number with an area code I didn't recognize. When Earl asked if I was feeling okay, I realized that I'd been standing motionless behind the counter for several minutes, staring at the card in my hand. The next day, I tried researching Dr. Sarah Chen and the phone number she'd given me, but found no information that would help me understand what organization she represented or what I might be agreeing to if I accepted her offer. The phone number traced to a disconnected line, and there were no online references to anyone matching her description in connection with unusual phenomena research. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched more closely than before. Cars seemed to follow me for longer distances. People appeared to be taking my photo from across parking lots, and I received phone calls that disconnected immediately when I answered. 2 days later, I called the number Dr. Chen had given me. She answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting for my call. "I accept your offer," I said, partly because I was curious about what the work would involve, and partly because I hoped that cooperation might provide some protection from the surveillance that was making my daily life increasingly uncomfortable. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've been filing weekly reports about anything unusual I observe, participating in monthly interviews about my experiences and observations, and wearing a small device that Dr. Chen claims helps protect me from unwanted attention by entities that are attracted to people who have had encounters with anomalous phenomena. I still work at Mel's Diner, but now I know that some of our customers aren't what they appear to be. I've learned to recognize the signs of people who are monitoring rather than simply stopping for food and coffee, and I've come to understand that my encounter 6 months ago marked me as someone of interest to organizations that operate far beyond normal government or corporate structures. The night shift at the diner has become more interesting since I started paying attention to the subtle signs that Dr. Chen taught me to recognize. I see things now that I never noticed before: conversations that stop when I approach, customers who pay attention to things that normal travelers wouldn't notice, vehicles that appear in our parking lot more frequently than random chance would suggest. I don't know exactly what organization Dr. Chen represents or what larger purpose my reports serve, but I've learned that the world contains far more surveillance and far more unusual activity than most people realize. And sometimes, late at night when the diner is quiet and I'm wiping down tables, I wonder how many other people have been approached by strangers who know their names and their secrets, offered choices between cooperation and continued surveillance, and inducted into networks of observation that monitor activities occurring just beyond the edge of normal awareness. The business card Dr. Chen gave me now sits in my wallet as a reminder that privacy is an illusion and that some encounters change your life in ways you never expect, connecting you to organizations and activities that exist in the spaces between official acknowledgement and hidden reality. I spent 12 years working as a geologist for Morrison Resource Surveys, a company that specialized in mineral exploration and subsurface analysis for mining corporations and energy companies. Most of our work involved routine soil sampling, core drilling, and geological mapping in remote areas where clients suspected valuable mineral deposits might be located. What we found during a survey in the Nevada desert in September 2021 changed my understanding of what might be buried beneath the Earth's surface. We'd been contracted by Titan Mining Corporation to conduct a preliminary assessment of a tract of land about 60 miles northwest of Las Vegas, in an area that showed geological formations consistent with rare earth mineral deposits. The survey team consisted of myself, 2 other geologists, a drilling crew of 4, and a project manager from Titan who was there to oversee the operation and ensure we followed the company's specific protocols. The area was typical of the Nevada high desert: barren hills, scattered vegetation, and rock formations that hadn't been significantly disturbed by human activity. Our survey grid covered approximately 5 square miles, with drilling sites positioned at regular intervals to provide comprehensive subsurface data. The work was routine and methodical, exactly the kind of systematic exploration I'd conducted hundreds of times before. For the first 3 days, our core samples showed exactly what we'd expected: sedimentary layers, mineral veins, and rock formations that matched the geological surveys that had led Titan to purchase the drilling rights. The cores contained traces of rare earth elements that justified continued exploration, and everything appeared to be proceeding according to standard procedures. On the 4th day, we began drilling at a site designated as Grid Point 7C, located in a shallow valley between 2 low ridges. The drilling began normally, with our equipment penetrating typical surface layers and extracting core samples that showed the expected geological composition. But at a depth of 347 feet, something changed dramatically. The drill bit encountered resistance that was unlike anything in my experience. Instead of the gradual pressure variations you'd expect when drilling through different rock layers, we hit what felt like a solid barrier that brought our progress to a complete stop. The drilling crew assumed we'd encountered an especially hard mineral formation and switched to more aggressive cutting equipment. When the enhanced drill bit finally penetrated the barrier, there was a sudden release of pressure that caused our equipment to drop nearly 3 feet in a matter of seconds. The drilling rig shuddered, and we heard a sound from deep in the hole that was unlike anything associated with normal geological drilling, a hollow echo that suggested we'd broken through into some kind of void or cavity. Our first assumption was that we'd encountered a natural cave system, which isn't uncommon in areas with limestone formations or underground water activity. But when we extracted the core sample from the breakthrough depth, what we found was deeply disturbing. The material wasn't rock, mineral, or any other geological substance I could identify. It appeared to be some kind of manufactured composite, metallic in appearance, but with a structure that didn't match any known alloys or building materials. The surface was smooth and uniform, with a slight iridescence that shifted depending on the angle of observation. Most unsettling was the fact that the material was warm to the touch, several degrees above the ambient ground temperature at that depth. It also exhibited a faint electrical conductivity that shouldn't have been present in any natural geological formation. When we tested it with standard geological analysis equipment, the results were inconclusive. The material showed properties that were consistent with both metallic and ceramic substances, while clearly being neither. The project manager from Titan immediately called his superiors to report the unusual discovery. Within 6 hours, a team of specialists arrived at our drilling site with equipment I'd never seen before and credentials that identified them as representatives of various federal agencies rather than mining industry personnel. Dr. Patricia Reeves, who appeared to be the leader of the new team, examined our core samples and drilling logs with the kind of familiarity that suggested she'd encountered similar materials before. When I asked her about the composition of what we'd discovered, her response was evasive but telling. This appears to be a manufactured structure of unknown origin, she said, bagging our samples in containers marked with symbols I didn't recognize. The new team immediately took over our drilling operation, installing their own equipment and expanding the hole to accommodate instruments that looked more like scientific research tools than mining exploration equipment. They worked around the clock for the next 3 days, extracting materials and data from the void we'd accidentally penetrated. On the second day of their operation, they brought up samples that were even more disturbing than the initial material we'd discovered. These included what appeared to be fragments of complex machinery, geometric shapes with internal structures that suggested sophisticated engineering and manufacturing capabilities. Some pieces showed evidence of having been damaged, possibly by our drilling, but others appeared to be intact components of systems whose purpose I couldn't even guess. Most unsettling was a piece that Dr. Reeves handled with extreme care and immediately sealed in a specialized container. It was roughly cylindrical, about 6 inches long, and it pulsed with a faint light that seemed to come from within the material itself. The light wasn't steady. It varied in intensity and color, creating patterns that seemed too regular to be random, but too complex to be easily decoded. On the third day, the team's equipment detected what they described as structural integrity concerns in the cavity below. Apparently, our drilling had damaged something that was maintaining the stability of whatever lay beneath the surface. Dr. Reeves made the decision to seal the hole immediately, using a concrete mixture that contained additives I'd never seen in standard drilling operations. Before departing, Dr. Reeves required all members of our original survey team to sign extensive confidentiality agreements that went far beyond the normal non-disclosure forms used in mineral exploration. The documents included clauses about national security, federal penalties for unauthorized disclosure, and ongoing monitoring requirements that essentially put us under permanent surveillance. We were also required to undergo medical examinations that included blood tests, neurological scans, and psychological evaluations. Dr. Reeves explained that exposure to unknown materials required health monitoring to ensure we hadn't experienced any adverse effects from contact with substances whose properties weren't fully understood. The official report filed by Titan Mining Corporation listed the drilling results as inconclusive due to equipment failure, with recommendations against further exploration in that area. The site was eventually purchased by a federal agency through a process that involved eminent domain and national security justifications that weren't made public. I never worked for Morrison Resource Surveys again after that project. The company dissolved 6 months later, officially due to financial restructuring, but actually because several government contracts were terminated and key personnel were reassigned to other positions. Dr. Martinez, our team leader, took a position with the USGS in Alaska. Thompson, our other geologist, moved to private consulting work that kept him away from large-scale drilling projects. I've spent the past 2 years working for smaller firms that focus on surface geology and environmental assessment, deliberately avoiding contracts that involve deep drilling or subsurface exploration. But I think about that discovery in Nevada constantly, wondering what we accidentally penetrated and what larger structure or facility might exist beneath the desert surface. The manufactured materials we extracted suggested technology that was far more advanced than anything I'd encountered in my geological training. The uniform construction, the electrical properties, and especially the self-illuminating component indicated capabilities that exceeded anything acknowledged in public engineering or materials science literature. Most disturbing was the implication that whatever we'd found had been deliberately buried, hidden beneath hundreds of feet of natural geological layers in a location where accidental discovery was extremely unlikely. The depth and location suggested that someone had gone to considerable effort to conceal evidence of technological capabilities that weren't supposed to exist. I've researched similar incidents reported by other geologists and drilling crews looking for patterns that might indicate how widespread such discoveries might be. What I've found is a scattered collection of reports describing encounters with manufactured materials, artificial cavities, and technological artifacts buried at depths that predate any known human construction in those areas. The reports are always followed by the same pattern: immediate government intervention, comprehensive confidentiality agreements, site sealing or acquisition, and the dispersal of team members to different positions that prevent them from discussing their experiences with colleagues who might understand the implications of what they discovered. Somewhere beneath the Nevada desert, sealed under hundreds of tons of specialized concrete, there's evidence of technological capabilities that challenge our understanding of what exists below the Earth's surface. And somewhere in government databases, there are records of similar discoveries that document a hidden infrastructure that operates according to principles we're not supposed to know about. I don't know who built what we found or how long it had been buried there, but I know that our accidental discovery revealed technology that was immediately classified at levels that extend far beyond normal mining industry security. The materials we extracted for those few days suggested capabilities that exist decades or centuries ahead of publicly acknowledged engineering, hidden beneath geological layers in locations where only the most systematic exploration would ever encounter them. The subsurface world contains secrets that go far beyond mineral deposits and natural formations, and some drilling projects accidentally penetrate barriers that were never supposed to be breached by civilian exploration teams operating according to standard geological survey protocols. We started the hike on Saturday morning from the Cascade River Trailhead, 4 college friends celebrating the end of finals week with a 3-day backpacking trip in the North Cascades. It was supposed to be a routine adventure. We'd all been hiking together for 2 years. We knew the trail well, and the weather forecast was perfect for late May camping. None of us expected that only 3 of us would return to the trailhead on Monday afternoon, and only 2 of us would make it home. The group consisted of myself, my roommate Jake, his girlfriend Emma, and our friend Marcus, who had organized the trip and selected the route. We were hiking a 12-mile loop that would take us through old-growth forest, past 2 alpine lakes, and over a moderate pass that offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. It was challenging enough to be interesting, but well within our capabilities as experienced hikers. The first day went exactly as planned. We covered 8 miles, set up camp beside Lake Catherine, and spent the evening cooking dinner over our camp stove while watching the sunset reflect off the water. The conversation was typical for our group. Discussions about post-graduation plans, jokes about professors we'd endured, and speculation about which trails we wanted to tackle next. Everything felt normal and comfortable, exactly the kind of relaxing trip we'd needed after a stressful semester. The second day started with clear skies and excellent trail conditions. We broke camp early and began the climb toward Cascade Pass, a moderate ascent through increasingly spectacular mountain scenery. Marcus was in his element, identifying wildflowers and geological formations while setting a steady pace that kept us moving efficiently without exhausting anyone. About 4 miles into the day's hike, we stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook that provided views across the valley we'd climbed from. Emma took photos while Jake and I consulted our maps to confirm our route for the afternoon. Marcus wandered a short distance from our lunch spot to examine some unusual rock formations that had caught his attention. That's the last time any of us saw Marcus as himself. After about 20 minutes, Jake called out to Marcus that we were ready to continue hiking. When Marcus didn't respond, we assumed he'd moved farther than we'd realized to get a better look at whatever geological features had interested him. Jake went to find him while Emma and I finished packing our lunch gear. Jake returned 5 minutes later with Marcus walking beside him, but something was wrong in a way that I couldn't immediately identify. Marcus looked exactly the same. Same clothes, same backpack, same physical appearance, but his demeanor had changed completely. The animated enthusiasm he'd shown all morning was gone, replaced by a blank, distant expression that made it seem like he was barely aware of our presence. I asked as Marcus approached our lunch spot. Marcus looked at me for several seconds before responding, as if he needed time to process the question. "Fine," he said finally, in a flat tone that bore no resemblance to his usual animated way of speaking. Emma and I exchanged glances, both of us clearly noticing that something was off about Marcus's behavior. But Jake didn't seem to have observed anything unusual, and when I quietly asked him if Marcus had seemed okay when he'd found him, Jake just shrugged and said Marcus had been looking at rocks and seemed normal. We continued hiking, but Marcus's behavior became increasingly strange as the afternoon progressed. He walked mechanically, maintaining perfect pace and following the trail accurately, but he showed no interest in the scenery that had fascinated him earlier. When Emma pointed out a particularly spectacular view, Marcus glanced in the direction she indicated, but showed no reaction or response. Most unsettling was his complete silence. The Marcus we knew was constantly talking, sharing information about the local ecology, making observations about trail conditions, cracking jokes about our hiking pace. But this Marcus spoke only when directly questioned, and his responses were minimal and emotionless. "Maybe he's just tired," Emma suggested when we stopped for a water break. But I was becoming increasingly convinced that something was seriously wrong. Marcus's body language was different, too controlled, too mechanical. His facial expressions were vacant in a way that suggested he wasn't really present, despite walking and responding to basic questions. Late in the afternoon, we reached our planned campsite beside Ptarmigan Lake. Setting up camp should have been a familiar routine, but Marcus's participation was robotic and minimal. He assembled his tent correctly, but without any of the efficiency or familiarity he'd always shown. He ate dinner mechanically, responding to conversation with single-word answers that contributed nothing to our usual group dynamic. Jake finally noticed that something was wrong when Marcus went to bed at sunset without participating in our traditional evening discussion about the next day's route. "He's definitely not feeling well," Jake said. But Emma and I were becoming seriously concerned that Marcus's condition was more than simple illness or fatigue. There was something fundamentally different about his behavior, as if the person we knew had been replaced by someone who looked identical but lacked all the personality traits that made Marcus himself. That night, I was awakened around 2 a.m. by sounds coming from Marcus's tent. Not the normal sounds of someone shifting position or dealing with discomfort, but a strange rhythmic tapping that continued for nearly an hour. When I unzipped my tent to check on him, the tapping stopped immediately, and Marcus's tent appeared to be still and quiet. The next morning, Marcus emerged from his tent at first light, already dressed and ready to break camp. But instead of the usual morning routine of gradually waking up and discussing the day's plans over coffee, he began packing his gear immediately, working with mechanical efficiency while showing no interest in breakfast or conversation with the rest of us. Emma asked. Marcus looked at her with the same vacant expression he'd displayed since Jake had found him at the rock formations. "Oh, time to go," he said in that same flat tone. We broke camp and began the final day's hike, a 6-mile descent that would take us back to the trailhead where we'd parked our cars. Marcus maintained his position in our hiking order, following the trail accurately and keeping pace, but he showed no recognition of familiar landmarks or interest in the changing scenery as we descended through different ecological zones. About 3 miles from the trailhead, Marcus simply stopped walking. We'd been hiking in single file down a steep section of trail with Marcus second in line behind me when I realized that the footsteps behind me had ceased. I turned around to see Marcus standing motionless on the trail, staring into the forest with that same blank expression. I called. He didn't respond or acknowledge that I'd spoken. Jake and Emma, who had been behind Marcus in the hiking order, approached and tried to get his attention, but Marcus remained completely still, as if he'd been turned off like a machine. We spent 20 minutes trying to communicate with Marcus, waving hands in front of his face, asking questions, even gently shaking his shoulders. But he showed no response to any stimuli, remaining perfectly motionless while staring into the trees beside the trail. Jake suggested that Marcus might be having some kind of medical emergency, a seizure or neurological episode that was causing his unresponsive state. We considered calling for emergency assistance, but we were in an area with no cell phone coverage and still 3 miles from the trailhead. After much discussion, we decided that Jake would stay with Marcus while Emma and I hiked out to get help. We left most of our water and emergency supplies with Jake, marked the location carefully on our map, and began hiking as quickly as we could toward the trailhead. We reached our cars in 2 hours and immediately drove to the nearest ranger station to report Marcus's condition and request a search and rescue response. The rangers organized a team that included medical personnel and began hiking back to the location where we'd left Jake and Marcus. But when the rescue team reached the marked location, they found only Jake, sitting beside the trail and obviously distressed. Marcus was gone, and despite extensive searching of the surrounding area, no trace of him was ever found. Jake's account of what happened was deeply disturbing. He said that Marcus had remained motionless for approximately 3 hours after Emma and I had left. Then, without any warning or change in expression, Marcus had walked directly into the forest, moving through the dense undergrowth with purpose and determination despite the difficult terrain. Jake had followed for several hundred yards, calling Marcus's name and trying to convince him to return to the trail. But Marcus had continued walking deeper into the wilderness, never responding to Jake's calls, never looking back, never showing any indication that he was aware of being followed. Eventually, Jake had lost sight of Marcus in the thick forest and had been unable to track him further. He'd returned to the trail to wait for the rescue team, hoping that Marcus would realize his mistake and return on his own. The search for Marcus continued for 5 days, involving dozens of volunteers, search dogs, and helicopter reconnaissance. But despite covering hundreds of square miles of wilderness, no trace of Marcus was ever found. No clothing, no equipment, no signs that he'd passed through any of the areas that were systematically searched. Emma and I returned home without our friend, carrying the knowledge that something had happened to Marcus at those rock formations that had fundamentally changed who he was. The person who had walked back to our lunch spot with Jake hadn't been the Marcus we knew, despite looking identical and possessing his memories and basic knowledge. Jake was deeply traumatized by the experience and refused to discuss the details of what had happened after Emma and I had left him alone with Marcus. He dropped out of school at the end of that semester and moved back to his hometown, cutting contact with our friend group and avoiding any reminders of our hiking trips. Emma and I tried to maintain some normalcy, but our friendship never recovered from the shared knowledge that we'd lost Marcus to something that we couldn't understand or explain. We both graduated, but we've rarely spoken since, each of us carrying the burden of questions that have no answers and memories that don't fit into any rational framework. I've never returned to the North Cascades, and I've never been able to enjoy hiking the way I did before that trip. The wilderness that once felt like a refuge now seems filled with possibilities that are too dangerous to risk encountering. Somewhere in those mountains, something took our friend and left behind a copy that looked right but was fundamentally wrong, a replacement that eventually walked away into the forest to join whatever had created it. The official missing person report lists Marcus as lost due to an apparent medical emergency that caused disorientation and poor decision-making. But I know that what we experienced was something far stranger and more disturbing than any medical explanation can account for. Marcus was taken and replaced, and when the replacement had served its purpose, it simply walked away, leaving us with the knowledge that our friend had disappeared into something that exists beyond the mapped boundaries of our familiar world.